welcome everybody to this very first panel of our conference, and the title is Architecture for a Better Future. And the first presentations we have is Solarpunk and Environmental Sustainability, a not so tragic technophilic marriage by Alejandro Rivero-Vadillo. And Alejandro from the Universidad de Alcalá. Alejandro, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. And also thank you for accepting my paper proposal for this series of conferences. So Solarpunk and environmental sustainability, this is what I will talk about today. The topic is a work in progress, in the sense that this is something I'm currently working on in my dissertation, my PhD dissertation, which deals with Solarpunk narratives and how they approach to technology, to ecology, and the different ecological traditions present in Solarpunk. So what I will do today is to simply compare Solarpunk depictions of actually a variety of Solarpunk, which I call Technophilic Solarpunk, and how these depictions actually reflect what the architect Vincent Collebot is contemporarily doing in his work in real life. And then I will try to problematize this approach to ecology and this approach to technological sustainability. So I'm hearing someone. Okay, so first of all, I would like to talk about what Solarpunk is, because I guess most of you don't know what this word even means, right? So Solarpunk is a fairly recent subgenre of cyberpunk, which also mixes climate fiction or cli-fi. So it is a sort of like a hybrid. And it was theorized during the late 2000s and early 2010s. Although, even though it was theorized, the text and the literary text, which is what I am interested in, came a few years later in the shape of short story collections. So basically, if we want to define Solarpunk, we can say that it is the evolution of cyberpunk in technological terms. So rather than using simply fossil fuels as an energy source for technology, it uses renewable sources of power, particularly solar panels. And it is generally optimistic. It tries to contest cyberpunk's ecological nihilism. If you remember any cyberpunk fiction, you will clearly see that it seems that the world is about to fall apart in ecological terms, right? So it has a clear focus on ways of using technology in environmental terms. And this is a complicated issue because we have different ways of understanding ecology, right? We have different discourses on environmentalism these days, and of course, Solarpunk shows them all. It is configured as a field of debate for these discourses, actually. So we have the technophilic paradigm. So we have stories that are focused on creating new spaces, new architectures, of course, high technological infrastructure, and this is important, adapting the environment, adapting nature to human needs or to industrial needs or to capitalist needs, as opposed to what the degrowth paradigm is doing, which is, focusing on adapting existing spaces, so not creating new things, using low-tech infrastructure, and seeing the human as something that needs to be included into the natural system and not the other way around. Now, as I say, I am not interested today in the degrowth paradigm because I want to explore how cities look like in the technophilic paradigm, in stories featuring this technophilic paradigm. I have chosen just two of them for the sake of the argument, but most technophilic solarpunk cities in art, but also in literature, look really similar. So we have, for instance, the one in the Boston Hearth project, a story by T.X. Watson in the short story collection Sunbelt, stories of solarpunk and eco-speculation. And in this story, what we have is the traditional cyberpunk plot, right? So we have a hacker who wants to take over a building that is used by the elites in Boston, in a climate change ravaged Boston. And basically this building can sustain most of the population of the city, but it's not being used for that. So it is interesting the way the building is described and is constructed. So in the story, we see that the Hale Center, this is the name of this building, is a big 15-story Art Deco revival temple with a custom engineered closed ecosystem. And it's the most thoroughly self-supported smart building to date in Massachusetts. The garages have massive triple gates that could slam the building utterly shut so it could manage its climate internally in extreme weather. Basically, what we have here is a microplanet with its own ecosystem, in a sustainable ecosystem that is created through the use of high technology. So basically, a technological way of surviving the Anthropocene in a building level. Now, this idea, also this Hale Center features, of course, solar power panels and, of course, a lot of trees everywhere. And this also happens in this other story, Iron Fox in the Marble City by Vlad Andrei Cuckoo, in which we have a very similar premise. So we have this cyborg ex-soldier that comes back to his hometown, which is Tokyo, and realizes that it has become a massive eco-city. And he describes it in the following way. Most of the buildings have been renovated with colorful decorations, marble supporters, and lush greens. Almost every building had trees growing around or was covered in various plants. The Tokyo Tower had been repurposed as a grand dome garden with rows of plantation and water canals all arranged around a metal device sitting where the former food town building used to be. So what we have is the implementation of this eco-building model into a massive way, creating a literally green city that is supposedly self-sustainable. Now, this might feel like fantasy or like very futuristic science fiction, but it's something that is actually happening right now, not to a massive level, but it is starting to happen right now. And this is when Vincent Callebaut's projects are interested to analyze in comparison with solarpunk architectures. This is the Taozhujinjuan Tower in Taipei. So it's actually built and it's a residence building, of course, for the elite, not for the Chinese masses. And it's marketed as a carbon absorbing vertical forest. And you can clearly see the solarpunk aesthetics of it, right? Even though I think it's actually Vincent Callebaut who is influencing contemporary stories on solarpunk. But what you can see is this wonderful, marvelous mixture between high technology and nature, or what we could call nature, right? So organic plant forms as a part of the building. It is interesting because it's, of course, this building is meant to have some ecological function, and you might perfectly guess it, right? So absorbing CO2, absorbing the CO2 that the industrial city is creating. And this is the interesting thing. So in order to solve contemporary problems on carbonization, what we do, or what these views are proposing, is to build even more things that are capable of absorbing the CO2 that we are producing, and that we can keep producing, since we now have this technological device, so to say, or technology that eco-technology that allow us to solve these climate issues, right? So instead of reducing, more and more and more industrialization. This is something that is real, but this is the project that Vincent Calabar has for Paris in 2050. Of course, very idealistic. I don't think it's going to be fulfilled ever, but we see this Solarpunk visuality of it, right? So we have these tall modern buildings that are vertical gardens that again are meant to solve the decarbonization crisis that we are currently experiencing. And it is interesting because what these views are proposing is not just growing more, which is already problematic, right? And growing in a capitalist sense, in a sense that does not allow for everyone outside the city to be covered by this. But because the thing is, these cities are separating the city from the planet, from the rest of the planet. They try to create self-sustainable cities that are created using materials that are not, that are actually scarce. So if we want to create architectures that depend on solar power, and we want to create massive architectures depending on solar power, we need the materials to construct these panels, right? And we know that these are rare materials that are again rare and scarce in the world. So how is it that we can aspire to create these structures as a way to palliate the climatic crisis? And the same with steel, the same with everything that these buildings have, even minerals or stones like marble. Eventually we will run out of all of it, and still we are or this technophilic Solarpunk, what it's doing or what it's promoting in a way is an idea that, okay, we can have this, we will always have these materials that will help us to survive and to even grow into the stars if we want to. So this is the normal problem that something that has been widely criticized by Solarpunk, and by other Solarpunk authors. And what I find interesting is that it would be very easy to criticize these ideas from a degrowth perspective, right? Because what we need to do is to reduce consumption. All this sort of discourses aiming to reduce, but there are also other discourses that combine the use of high technology in a different way than the models that I have just explained. And this is what I am currently working on. This is why this is a work in progress as well. And I would like to simply use Benjamin Bratton's book on the terraforming, which I commented before, because I think it's interesting what he thinks about these projects that separate the city from the rest of the environment that they depend on. And he says that regional preserves, so basically spaces, are arranged by artificially delineated boundaries between city and park, but the preserve ecosystem still functions as part of a larger metabolism of energy flow, storage, digestion, and expenditure, contained as always by layered atmospheric schemes. It's never an absolute outside physically or metaphysically, though today many areas are used as landfills precisely because the culture-nature divide allows some to believe that the outside really is external. Meaning that if we want to investigate and to research on possibilities of combining high technology and these is linked, of course, with terraforming and the environment and the world in a way. What we need to do is not to think of cities as self-sustainable cities, but as planets, as a self-sustainable planet that features highly technologized cities, but that in a way are related and depend on sustainable resources and not the minerals that we are now depending on, and on fossil fuels as well. So I would like to finish here because, as I say, this is a work in progress. So there is so much to investigate, to research on, but I guess I can give you some preliminary conclusions. First, that there is this technophilic Solarpunk that is providing problematic solutions to climate change, even to climate change imagination, and to the imagination of solutions to climate change. And that although this Solarpunk, these narratives are inspired by examples that are being materialized these days, they still present an imaginary of consumption that is hardly to imagine, it's hard to imagine it to be sustainable in the long term. So what I'm questioning right now myself is if there is a possibility of imagining realistic, fully sustainable spaces from a technophilic perspective in Solarpunk. And this is everything I have for you. I think I did not cover more than 20 minutes. So if you have any question or anything, please let me know. I will be very happy to answer.
Thank you. Perfect timing as well.
Great.
So I think we can go on to the second presenter. So then we can have all the questions afterwards. And the next presentation is Technological Solutions to Narrativized Problems, the Ideological Construction of the Golden Gate Suicide Barrier. And the presenter is Caitlyn Stewart from the University of Illinois. And Caitlyn, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me. Okay, I'll jump right into it. And my presentation slides have important quotes and things that I'm going to discuss, just so everyone's on the same page. So I wanted to disappear. So the Golden Gate was the spot. I'd heard that the water just sweeps you under. I still see my hands coming off the railing. I instantly realized that everything in my life that I thought was unfixable was totally fixable, except for having just jumped. This quote by suicide survivor Ken Baldwin is a defining feature of Tad Friend's provocative 2003 New Yorker piece entitled Jumpers, a collection of vignettes following the stories of those who survived jumps from the Golden Gate Bridge. It may have been Friend's first project on the bridge's unusually high number of suicide cases, but his voice was a poignant addition to an already expansive history of discourse on what has come to be known as the world's #1 suicide magnet. Averaging around 30 suicides a year and totaling over 1,400 deaths since its opening in 1937, the Golden Gate has maintained a reputation across its long lifetime of being something of a suicide destination. But Friend's story, though not necessarily new information for San Francisco residents or those familiar with the bridge's de facto nickname, ultimately became a signpost for the start of renewed and more widespread interest in the Bridge of Death. Over the years, a variety of measures and technologies have been employed in places like San Francisco that contain, as many have called them, suicide bridges, to reduce the number of jumps. These innovations range from suicide hotline telephones to patrol cameras, security gates, and buzzer systems at the Golden Gate alone. No technology has been more popular or widely debated, though, than the suicide barrier, a steel net built underneath a bridge and extended outward on both sides, designed to deter jumpers by blocking any potential fall. The long history of the Golden Gate suicide barrier, whose installation various advocates had backed for more than 60 years before the project was officially approved and funded in 2014, is intimately tied to the narratives that popular pieces like Friend's Jumpers produced for public consumption during this time. Placing the blame for high suicide rates on the bridge itself, these narratives opened and reopened public debate over how to best address the Golden Gate's reputation and pointed toward preventative technologies as the solution. Thus, the implementation of the suicide barrier bookends a long process of attempts by scientific researchers to solve an ideologically constructed problem with technological innovations. The snowball effect of increasing public attention paid to the Golden Gate's reputation as one of the world's greatest suicide destinations can be attributed to a variety of co-inspired creative projects that were released within a short span in the early 2000s. Friends Jumpers, The Joy of Life, a Sundance film that details the history of the Golden Gate created by Jenny Olsen, who also called for a suicide barrier in a letter to the San Francisco Chronicle, and The Bridge, Eric Steele's provocative documentary capturing the deaths of those who jumped from the bridge during his year-long study of the monument in 2004. As the final and most widely popularized piece of media during this time period, The Bridge and its subsequent controversy provide fitting inroads for an investigation into the particular language and conceptualizations that all of these projects mobilized. Though Steele's documentary was indeed the representative catalyst for widespread public and then bureaucratic approval of plans for the Golden Gate suicide barrier, all of the projects that inspired and joined in conversation with its discourse can be examined as part of a larger narrative that inspired this turn towards its technological solution. The idea that the Golden Gate itself is the problem, or the narrative of the Bridge of Death. The earliest iteration of this narrative in media representations, Jumpers, lays thematic groundwork that all the subsequent projects on the topic of suicide at the Golden Gate seem to maintain. Friend frames the piece as a series of stories capturing the personal experiences of survivors of the jump from the bridge, positioning himself as the mediator of a rare and unique encounter. The reader, through Friend's interpretation, gains access to the thought processes of the few and far between victims who have made the fall and who are still alive to talk about it. This piece presents itself then as an authoritative voice that speaks to a unilateral and generalized experience of jumping from the Golden Gate Bridge. Within this framing, the narrative work that Friend does to tie these stories together gets obfuscated by an implicit assumption that the connection between them is already given. The idea that all of the victims of the fall from the Golden Gate undergo a singular experience with similar motivations, thought processes, and emotional progressions. This assumption belies the subjective thread that Friend uses to transform the mosaic of stories into a singular narrative arc, that the survivors of the leap from the bridge, and as the title implies, the jumpers from the Golden Gate en masse, regret their actions during the fall. I was praying for God to give me another chance, Friend quotes survivor Paul L.A. on his memory of the experience. I'll never put my life on the line again. Several other jumpers collaborate this feeling as Friend summarizes their commentary by saying that they had cited a fear of losing courage in the moments leading up to the jump. Survivors often regret their decision in midair, if not before, he concludes, reinforcing his authority as unilateral interpreter of these events and producing a narrative that the tragedy of suicides committed from the Golden Gate lies in the victim's ultimate unwillingness to die. Turning the focus away from mental illness, self-harm, and the idea of suicide itself, then, Friend centers his piece instead on a victimhood specifically predicated on the jumpers' regret in midair. In the end, they did not want to die, and that is the real tragedy. In this way, the underlying problem that his piece showcases is not, as it might seem, suicide. It's the Golden Gate itself. Quoting a local psychiatrist, Friend compares the bridge to having a loaded gun on your kitchen table. This idea of the bridge as culprit provides an easy foundation for the second half of Friend's piece, which details the history of controversy surrounding movements for suicide prevention on the bridge and advocates for a suicide barrier. Because he's established that the design of the bridge is responsible for welcoming, attracting, and even facilitating the deaths of so many potentially regretful victims, the transition to proposing an architectural salve is an easy and logical one. In other words, if the problem is the bridge of death, then the solution is to make the bridge less deadly. No piece of media during this period of renewed interest in the Golden Gate suicide rates better highlights this problem and solution construction than the conclusion to Friend's piece. As people who work on the bridge know, smiles and gentle words don't always prevent suicides. A barrier would, but to build one would be to acknowledge that we do not understand each other, to acknowledge that much of life is lived on the cord, on the far side of the railing. Joseph Strauss believed that the Golden Gate would demonstrate man's control over nature, and so it did. No engineer, however, has discovered a way to control the wildness within. In this framing, the underlying human problem, suicide, is written off as unsolvable and then reconfigured into the more solvable science problem of engineering. The final call of Friend's piece is not, as might seem at first, to examine San Francisco's mental health crisis or imagine a means of bolstering services of support. but rather to directly address the Golden Gate's apparent suicide magnetism. In this way, suicide is broken down into manageable variables, thereby constructing a problem for the express purpose of producing a solution. In other words, Friend declares that if we can't solve the problem of mental illness, the wildness within, as he says, then we should focus on the man-made problem that we can solve, the bridge. This narrative is exactly the thread that Jenny Olsen takes up in The Joy of Life, a film that attempts to document the history of San Francisco's struggle to gain consensus in support of the installation of a suicide barrier on the Golden Gate. The script for the film notes that from the outset, the bridge was appraised for its potential as a means of suicide. In identifying the origin of the Golden Gate's relationship with suicide as inherent within the very construction of the bridge itself, Olsen anchors her historical account with the guiding idea that the architectural design of the Golden Gate is a fundamental problem at hand. In a narrative reminiscent of the Titanic's premature and inaccurate reputation as being an unsinkable ship, Olsen foreshadows the coming tragedy of now more than 1,300 suicidal victims by placing blame on what she implies is a fatal design flaw. The fatal flaw idea, rooted in the Bridge of Death narrative, and still a large part of current discourse surrounding landmarks like the Golden Gate that have high suicide rates, follows the perspective of Friend's piece in viewing the jumpers as unwilling victims of the bridge's magnetism. As the 2012 Los Angeles Times article summarizes, public sentiment still operates within this framework. While we rightly admire the bridge's beauty, grandeur, engineering, and construction, how do we come to terms with its terrible allure? How do we calibrate its value as a world treasure against the real tragedies enacted on it? The Golden Gate Bridge is a public health hazard. In The Joy of Life, this deadly allure of the Golden Gate is acknowledged and attributed, moreover, to its initial construction. In this way, the ultimate tragedy of its high suicide rates lies not in the loss of life alone, but rather in the idea that such loss of life could have been prevented from the outset. Like the narratively similar discourse surrounding the inadequate number of lifeboats on the Titanic, Olsen's rendering of the Golden Gate's problem emphasizes the negligence of its engineers to suggest that the solution, in this case a suicide barrier, could have been in place the entire time. In light of the evolution of the Bridge of Death narrative that the previous popular media representations of the Golden Gate's problem highlight, then, it's no wonder that a filmmaker like Eric Steele should come along at this moment and pick up the ideological thread already established for him. Taking inspiration from Jumpers shortly after its publication, Steele embarked on a year-long film study of the Golden Gate. For a full 12 months in 2004, he directed multiple crews to train cameras on the bridge from various angles and ranges in an attempt to document a year in the life of the bridge and a year in the deaths of its suicide victims. Having captured 23 of the occurring 24 suicides that year, Steele released his documentary in 2006 amidst a storm of controversy. What was hailed by some as one of the most moving and brutally honest films about suicide ever made, sparked outrage in others for showing the deaths on screen. To make matters worse, Steele had obtained permission both to film the bridge and to interview the families of victims under false pretenses. The language he had used to secure the shooting permit was that he intended to document the powerful, spectacular intersection of monument and nature that takes place every day at the Golden Gate Bridge. And he had talked to victims' families without informing them that he had captured their suicides on film. Recording suicides on camera as a means of drawing attention to this constructed problem and of advocating for a particular solution is in some ways not so different than the work that Friend and Olsen have done in narrativizing personal stories for their own projects. As one review of Steele's documentary describes, for all its discussion of mental illness, the bridge is metaphysically rather than clinically oriented. No mental health professionals are on hand to talk about suicide. Though this reviewer sees such a move as an artistic choice, it's inherently political. Steele places blame on the metaphysical space itself, the Bridge of Death, just as his predecessors have. What these narratives popularized by Friend, Olsen, and Steele suggest is that if San Francisco is not just a microcosm of the larger world, but an actual hotspot that itself produces a suicide contagion, or if the Bridge of Death is truly to blame for luring unwilling victims over its fatal ledge, then suicide can be prevented. Narrativizing the problem in a way that claims such universal stakes at the same time that it makes culpable a supposed flaw in engineering that necessitates a solution that is a technology purporting to address a fundamental human problem. Thus, scientific researchers are charged with the task of evaluating the potential effectiveness of this technology based on metrics predetermined not by objective criteria, but rather by public discourse and popular media. The Bridge of Death narrative, in other words, ultimately constructs the solution as well as the problem. The long history of the Golden Gate suicide barrier illustrates the difficulties involved in bringing such a technology into material reality. Anything from federal funding technicalities to pushback on aesthetic design can present an obstacle that massively delays production, or in some cases halts it altogether. But the greatest challenge that such projects seem to face, particularly for the Golden Gate Bridge in light of widespread media attention, is that of public and bureaucratic approval. In both cases, this approval is based on a cost-benefit analysis model that weighs various subjective downsides against nebulous objective concept of use value. Residents and benefactors alike want to know whether or not the financial, aesthetic, or environmental costs will be worth the ultimate benefit. So in order to make this judgment, those with any kind of stake in the proposed project turn to statistical analyses, or more commonly news outlets that disseminate the information from such analyses that purport to quantify the effectiveness of suicide barriers. In this cost-benefit value model, the underlying factor that determines whether or not any given suicide barrier will be approved and installed is the comparative data collected from similar projects. The resulting reports are almost entirely produced by researchers in the field of psychiatry, who treat the barriers as subjects of natural experiments in order to produce comparative data sets. Using approaches uniform across the discipline, the scientists will compare data before and after barrier installation to produce conclusions that purport to definitively determine the effectiveness of the technology. Because such an experiment is conducted utilizing the universally accepted scientific method, and because the resulting report is published in a reputable scientific journal, this research becomes the basis for both public and official determinations of the benefit of suicide barriers in the larger value model. What is missed in the general acceptance of these statistical analyses as determining evidence of effectiveness, though, is the influence of human actors on the direction and result of the research. Following the scientific method, the people conducting these natural experiments begin with a research question, but this question is not produced in a vacuum. Despite the pervasive notion that researchers have multiple reasons for engaging in these projects, the two most apparent of which, in the case of the suicide barrier, are the pressure from those invested in producing a verifiable justification for or against the technology, and the financial support from funding sources deeming the investigation worthwhile. In other words, the powers that be want to know once and for all if suicide barriers really work, and thus the scientist research question is born. This chain of human influence then produces experiments that are conducted to answer the following basic research question: does X barrier increase rates of Y suicide in Z city? In the case of the Golden Gate Bridge, for example, future research conducted post-installation would ask the question, does the Golden Gate Bridge barrier decrease rates of suicide by jumping in San Francisco? In answering this question, however, the results of such an experiment have little to no bearing on the problem that the barrier is supposedly designed to address, suicide. Rather than evaluating whether or not the net system on the Golden Gate Bridge is effective in reducing suicide rates, this research question would yield only an analysis of jumping suicides in this one particular bridge in San Francisco. More alarming than the possibility that any given number of people deterred from jumping from the Golden Gate Bridge simply would commit suicide by another means is the inability of current methods of research to quantify that possibility. If the basic research question from above were refined to repose the actual question that the suicide barriers purport to answer, the process might unfold as follows. Does X barrier decrease rates of Y suicide in Z city? To does X barrier decrease rates of Y suicide? To does X barrier decrease rates of suicide? To do suicide barriers decrease rates of suicide? In these revisions, the quantifiable variables needed for scientific research are erased. In this way, the most basic form of the question is not a scientific one, but a human and ultimately unanswerable one. I seek here not to cast off scientific research, but rather to unsettle the notion that the results of such research provide factual answers to the questions we assume they're asking. Moreover, I want to suggest that technologies like suicide barriers are often designed, implemented, and evaluated based on a false idea of efficiency that tends to obfuscate the complex network of financial, social, political, and personal factors facilitating all of these processes. That technologies owe their conception and production to a plethora of human interests can often remain unacknowledged and elided from public understanding. And in the case of suicide barriers, this false perception can have potentially harmful impacts on quality of life for many people in society. If we were to see that reports evaluating the efficiency of a technology like the suicide barrier answer the question, does this technology do what it was designed to do, rather than the question, does this technology help solve the problem of suicide, then we might be able to see more clearly solutions that actually address the fundamental problem at hand. And that's all I have. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you. It was a very interesting presentation on a topic that I definitely think it's often forgotten and not talked about. Absolutely. Let's see if we have any question from the public. And I don't know, I can just maybe ask you, Katie, a question, and then we have one by Laura. I was just thinking, as you were mentioning this documentary and all of these narratives that incorporate actual witness accounts, so to speak, doesn't that have now a bit of a true crime taste to it? Because you know that there's a trend in this genre of documentaries, sort of fictional, half real documentaries. So how do you think it is represented, the issue, how it is narrated in these documentaries that you're mentioning?
Yeah, absolutely. It does very much relate to true crime as a genre. I don't know if people are familiar, but there's a podcast that came out, I think a few years ago, called S-Town, which is about a small town in Alabama where there was supposedly a murder committed, and they go and they try to investigate that. And the main person they're talking to ends up committing suicide. And the podcast becomes an investigation as to why he's done that. And so I think that sort of idea of trying to investigate why people have done this, why people commit suicide, I think that is underlying a lot of these narratives, especially the documentary that you mentioned. I think it's very much something that people really want to have a solid answer to, which really relates to this idea of trying to problem solve, trying to construct a solid problem so that we can get a solid solution to kind of ease our own misunderstanding and our inability to understand those issues. So definitely that I see that as very related.
And a sort of fascination as well that gets fed on these kind of documentaries, right? Because we all want to see the cringy details and how this happens. Thank you. Laura, you have a question?
Hi, can you hear me? Okay, so my question is for Alejandro, and I guess I have kind of a literary question in a sense, more like literary analysis, because I work with postmodern American fiction, and I use this idea of the city and the building, and especially, you know, skyscrapers, it's very associated with cosmopolitanism, late capitalism, and this works often as both literally and metaphorically in literature, in opposition to, say, the woods or the desert. And these instances where buildings are mentioned tends to be very symbolic in a sense. Sometimes they are mentioned, buildings or skyscrapers, as a stand-in for some form of critique to capitalism. And to me, it was very interesting how you mentioned that this technophilia that you find in this literature that you analyze. And I think it also works in science fiction and the cyberpunk that you were mentioning, and steampunk, maybe, like the way these buildings work, it's kind of in a sense oppressive and a sign of this abusive form of capitalism or late capitalism in a sense. So I was wondering how, in this literary sense, how this idea of buildings works in the narrative. When they mention buildings in Solarpunk, do they have a positive connotation because of this technophilia that's underlying? And how does it work if it's not in opposition to ecology or, you know, the woods and nature, as it often is in postmodern narratives and I guess realism in general? So if you don't have that opposition between the building and technology to nature, how do they conceptually bring them together, and how is it opposed to? If that makes sense, I hope it does.
Yes. What a great question. it's interesting because in cyberpunk we see, well, we only see buildings in cyberpunk, for instance. In Solarpunk we see buildings, and sometimes we also see rural spaces with no buildings. But yes, there is a reversal of this conceptualization of the building and the city as an oppressive place, and this is what politically the Solarpunk movement aims to, I guess, because it actually emerges as a reaction to this understanding of the city as a naturally horrible place, right? And so the way it works in Solarpunk, well, there are many Solarpunk and Solarpunk cities, but at least in the technophilic ones, what we see is an attempt to naturalize or renaturalize the notion of the building, basically with all the good things that buildings have, with also what we want the buildings to be in relation to nature. So that's why there is this focus on the green, on adding trees to everything, because it creates the simulation that we need to symbiotically merge these two worlds, right? This sense of the city and the non-city, so the desert or the forest or whatever that is, and I think it works as a positive space in that sense, in the sense that it manages to combine in a very post-human way our desire for nature with our need for buildings and our need to or a need for consumption, the consumption that we do in and the consumerism that we practice in buildings and cities, right?
Because
I don't know if this solves the question, but
yeah, sure. I think it's interesting that just what you said just now about the green, that the conceptualization clearly comes from something that's very ingrained in our minds, like buildings and overpopulated cities bad, green forests good. So we bring the green and these kind of associations with nature into, like, we put it on top of the buildings kind of to make it look pretty, and we superimpose the positive associations of nature into buildings which are already negative. Like there's, I think that negative association with the buildings, it's ironically still there somehow.
Yeah, it is still there, and even it also really looks like a simulation in the sense that like whenever you think about these cities full of trees on the roofs, like if you think about how trees work, like trees are probably going to eventually consume the whole building and so destroy the building. So we need a way to actually cut the trees in a rational way so they're not as invasive as we want them to be. So still there is this consideration of dominating this nature that still we want in our places, right? As a reminder that we are still part of nature in a way.
Yeah, I think that there's of course, in these kind of buildings, there's a big issue in sustainability and maintenance that quite often these projects don't quite consider in a way, because you really need to do so much work to maintain that. And we go back to what Jerry was saying, that it's not really concretely sustainable, this kind of engineering that tries to put together two things that they're not quite meant to be together in a way.
And even I would even say that there is a fascination for trees, right? Like trees are the representation of nature in a way, but nature is not just trees, and environmentalism and CO2 absorption is not just about trees. And there is this thing in Solarpunk that all cities have trees, regardless of whether they are. So they can be in the desert, they can be in the tundra, they can be literally anywhere, and they need this idea of the tree inside this micro ecosystem, or this artificial ecosystem, right? And so there is also, I was just thinking about the fact that, you know, green is not necessarily natural, right? And the idea that they want to impose this model of tree cities, it's not they want to impose, but they offer this model as a great model for survival, is interesting, because even if it applies, and it doesn't really apply to the Western world, it only applies to West or to the Northern Hemisphere in a way.
I think we have one last question to close with Tyler.
Yeah, thanks. Just a quick one for Katie. It strikes me that I'm not in the US at the moment, but it seems like your comments dovetail nicely with the conversation around the infrastructure bill, in particular the way that mental health concerns, for instance, are trying to be folded into an infrastructure bill. Would you see that as an extension of the same sort of ideological construction you're highlighting? And maybe would you speculate about what would be at stake if we reverse it, if we put infrastructure into a mental health bill, for instance?
Yeah, I do think that's an extension of this. And I think more broadly, we're having more of a focus in the US on science and technology as sort of the field to be in. I think that's an extension of it as well, where we feel like we can solve problems in a tangible way through science and technology. And this is where this idea is coming from. We have something like mental health that we don't fully understand, and we have this crisis and we're trying to solve it. And we think, oh, we can solve it by doing architectural changes and infrastructure, because that's something that we believe is really tangible and something that we see as having a lot of positive influence. And so, yeah, I think that's definitely an extension. And in terms of sort of imagining it the other way, I'm not entirely sure what that might look like. But I do think that in terms of this project and what I'm really researching and trying to get out there is sort of having everyone who wants to try to do this problem solving through science to see that these scientific research projects and research questions are produced oftentimes from narrative and from things that they don't think that they are. So I think by opening that up, we might have an idea of, okay, we're not actually solving this problem by doing this. That doesn't necessarily make it bad. It just means that we're solving a different problem. So maybe we need to actually funnel resources into things that might address mental illness rather than this actual problem of suicide off of this particular bridge. So yeah, thank you so much for the question.
Thanks for your thoughts.
Thank you. And I think on this, we can close. Thank you very much for both your presentations, very interesting. And I think even though they were quite different in some way, they did fit together as we are thinking about this kind of architectures that need to also include humans in their projects. And with this, thank you very much. Thanks to the public